My name is Vincenza, and at 34 years old, my husband slapped me in front of his mother. I thought she'd defend him, but she called the cops and brought his reign of abuse crashing down. If you have ever felt betrayed by the people who should have been your biggest supporters, let me know where you are watching from. For 4 years, I had been treading on eggshells around Adrian Keller. The slap began tiny, a quick backhand when food was cold and a shove when I disagreed with him. Always behind closed doors, followed by apologies and pledges that it would not happen again. His mother had come for the weekend, and I had been working so hard to be the ideal wife. Eleanor Whitmore was everything I wasn't: polished, educated, and descended from the small southern town's founding families. She'd made it obvious from the start that I wasn't good enough for her son, the girl from the wrong side of town who trapped her beautiful boy in an unwanted pregnancy, which we lost 4 months into our marriage. Eleanor had a knack of making me feel small without saying anything directly hurtful. She'd run her finger over surfaces looking for dust, recommend better cleaning products with a hint of disdain, or casually note Adrienne's ex-girlfriend was such a great cook and came from such a nice family. Every interaction seemed like a test that I failed. Every discussion is a reminder of my shortcomings. I made her favorite dishes all weekend, including cucumber sandwiches with the crusts removed, Earl Grey tea served at the perfect temperature, and beef Wellington that took 6 hours to prepare correctly. I cleaned the house twice, vacuuming carpets that did not require vacuuming and polishing silver that was already pristine. I bit my tongue as she criticized everything from my cooking to my clothing choices to the way I put flowers in the guest room. She had this way of gazing at me as if I were a stain on her beautiful furniture, something unattractive that needed to be dealt with, but was too offensive to address openly. Her displeasure pervaded every room she entered. The explosion occurred over something foolish, as they often do. I had unintentionally used the nice china for lunch rather than conserving it for evening. It was an honest error. I was so concerned about impressing her that my hands shook as I set the table, and I grabbed the wrong dishes from the cabinet, Adrienne's grandmother's Haviland china, with lovely blue blooms. Each item was worth more than I earned in 1 week at the bookshop where I worked part-time. Adrienne's cheeks turned scarlet as soon as he noticed the exquisite porcelain, and the vein in his temple began to throb like it always did when his fury flared up. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he asked, his voice low and threatening in a way that made my stomach clench with familiar fear. "I specifically told you those were for tonight when the Langfords come over. Those plates are worth more than you make in a month." "I'm sorry," I said quietly, reaching to clear the table with quivering hands, careful not to clink the fine china together. "I'll wash them carefully and reset everything with the everyday dishes. I promise I'll be more careful next time." His mother sat right there, sipping her tea from one of the lovely cups, as if nothing had happened, her flawlessly placed lipstick leaving no trace on the rim. I hoped her presence would keep him quiet. Perhaps he wouldn't dare to reveal his true nature in front of the woman whose opinion was more important to him than everything else in the world, including his wife's safety. I had never been so incorrect about anything in my life. Adrian gripped my wrist so tightly that I felt the bones grind together, his fingers wrapping entirely around my narrow arm. "You never listen, do you? You're too stupid to follow simple instructions. How many times do I have to explain things before they penetrate that thick skull of yours?" The usual panic rose in my chest like floodwater. This was how it always started. Remarks meant to make me feel useless, a grip that left purple fingerprints for days, and the way he made me believe that everything wrong in his life was somehow my responsibility. I tried to break away, but his hold tightened, bringing tears to my eyes. The fragile bones in my wrist felt as if they would fracture under the pressure. "Please," I whispered quietly, looking nervously at his mother, hoping she'd interfere. "You're hurting me." His mother continued to drink her tea, her face expressionless, as if she were watching a somewhat entertaining television show. There was no help coming from that direction. She'd probably blame me for embarrassing her son, for causing drama during her visit, and for being the type of woman who incited men to violence because of her own inadequacy. That's when he did it. There, in front of his mother, in the middle of their spotless dining room, complete with crystal chandelier and a mahogany table passed down through generations. He brought his hand back and slapped me in the face, so hard that my ears rang and I tasted blood. The hit sent me stumbling backward against the antique sideboard, my hip colliding with its sharp edge. A crystal vase full of fresh roses wobbled dangerously before I grabbed it with my free hand, adding insult to injury. Now I was the clumsy wife who couldn't even take a proper hit without endangering more valuable family heirlooms. I stood there, astonished, my cheeks scorching as if someone had pressed a hot iron across my skin, waiting for his mother to gasp, object, or do something, anything. She'd always been so proper, so concerned with looks, social decorum, and upholding the family's standing in the neighborhood. Domestic violence in her dining room would undoubtedly cross a boundary, if only in terms of propriety. Instead, she laid her teacup down with a gentle clink and gazed squarely at her son. The sound appeared to echo in the sudden silence, like a bell tolling the hour. "Adrian James Keller," she announced, her voice piercing through the silence like a razor through silk. "What did you just do?" Something in her tone caused Adrian to freeze entirely, his hand still up from the slap. It was not the voice of a surprised mother-in-law. It wasn't surprise, terror, or dismay. It was something altogether different, carrying the weight of absolute authority and years of accumulated information about the type of man her son truly was. The same tone that had surely horrified him as a child when he'd broken something expensive or tracked muck through her spotless home. The voice of repercussions looming like storm clouds on the horizon. He stammered, attempting to compose words, but she raised one perfectly manicured finger. The gesture was modest but forceful, as if she were leading an orchestra and had just asked for total silence. "I asked you a question," she said, her tone totally calm. "What did you just do to your wife?" Adrian's face turned white, then red, and then white again, as if someone was tweaking the color balance on an ancient television. I could see him searching for an excuse, some way to downplay what had just happened, some way to blame it on me, like he always did, some way to convince his mother that I deserved it, that any rational guy would have done the same thing. "She was being disrespectful," he replied softly, his voice trembling slightly like a teenager's. "She needs to learn to follow instructions. You know how careless she is with nice things. She never thinks before she acts. She's always breaking something or making mistakes." His mother rose slowly, her chair scratching against the hardwood floor. The sound resonated across the room like a gunshot in a temple. She was a petite lady, just 5'4" tall in sensible heels, yet she seemed to fill the entire area with her presence. The look on her face was something I'd never seen before, and I'd known her for 4 years. It wasn't anger, but something colder and more menacing, something deliberate and predatory that caused Adriani to take a step backward, crashing against the wall behind him like a cornered animal. "Sit down," she said. And Adriani actually did, sliding into his chair like a scolded kid, his lips opening and closing like a fish struggling for air, but no sound came out. Eleanor walked over to me with measured steps, her heels clicking against the floor with military precision, and I thought she was going to slap me too, finish what her son had started, tell me I deserved it for being clumsy with her precious china, for embarrassing her son in front of her, for being the type of woman who drove men to violence through her own stupidity and carelessness. Instead, she gently took my chin in her perfectly manicured hand and tilted my face toward the light streaming through the bay window. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, as if she was examining a piece of damaged artwork that could be restored with enough care and patience. The red handprint was already darkening into a bruise that would last for weeks, and my lip had split where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. I could taste copper and feel my pulse throbbing in it. "How long?" she asked calmly, her gaze never leaving my pained face. "I don't understand," I mumbled, perplexed by her sudden kindness and the way she looked at me as if she cared what happened to me. "How long has my son been hitting you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, heavy and suffocating. And I could feel Adriana's eyes bore into me from across the room, silently threatening what would happen later if I told the truth. The familiar fear crept up my spine like ice water, the fear that had kept me silent for 4 years. The fear that had convinced me to stay in a marriage that was slowly killing my spirit. I am not. I mean, he does not. This was simply... I tripped over the words, the falsehoods flowing naturally after years of practice. Don't lie to me, she murmured calmly, but with steel in her voice. I've been watching you for 4 years. I understand what terror looks like on a woman's face. I understand what careful motions look like, what forced grins look like, and what it implies when someone flinches whenever a door bangs or a voice is raised. She turned to face Adrian, her voice lowering to a whisper, which was more horrifying than shouting. 4 years ago, you returned from your honeymoon with a black eye. You stated that during your sunset cruise, you stepped into a door and were smacked in the face by a low beam as the boat swayed. I knew you were lying, but I suspected she had hit you. I was almost happy that you'd married someone strong enough to fight back. Adrian's jaw dropped wide, his looks shifting between amazement, denial, and increasing panic. Mom, I raised you better than this, she said, her voice becoming stronger, with each syllable like a storm brewing. I raised you to protect women, not terrorize them. I raised you to be a man of honor, not a coward who uses his stature to intimidate someone smaller and weaker. Your father may have been a jerk in many ways, but he never struck me or your children in rage. He had flaws. God knows he had plenty of them. But he was not a coward. That wasn't entirely true, and we all knew it. I'd heard whispered stories from Adrian's in-laws during business about their father's rages, the holes punched, disappointments, the way their mother would wear long sleeves in the summer and makeup that was just a little too heavy around her eyes after particularly bad fights. But apparently, Eleanor had decided to rewrite history, or maybe she'd convinced herself that emotional abuse and intimidation didn't count as real. She walked to her purse, an expensive leather bag that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and took out her phone, the most recent model, in a case that suited her clothing precisely and probably cost more than most people's weekly shopping budget. What are you doing? Adrian inquired, terror coming into his voice for the first time since I'd known him. His face had turned absolutely white, and I could see a vein pulsating furiously in his temple. I'm calling your sister, Beatrice, and then I'm calling the police. The room went dead silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, and the sound of my own pulse pounding so hard that I was sure everyone could hear it. Even the birds outside appeared to have stopped singing. Adrian jumped up so quickly that his chair tipped backward and collapsed to the floor, making a sound like broken bones. You can't do that, he snarled, his voice rising to a pitch I hadn't heard before and cracking like an adolescent voice. This is between me and my wife. It is not your concern what happens in my marriage. You can't meddle with our private affairs. Eleanor gazed at him with the loathing normally reserved for something scraped off your shoe after walking through a particularly unpleasant part of town. Everything you do is my business when you're doing it wrong, she said with an eerily composed tone. I didn't spend 35 years building this family's reputation in this town, serving on charity boards and hosting fundraisers and being a pillar of the community to have you destroy it all by beating your wife like some common thug from the trailer park. I realized then that she wasn't defending me out of compassion, moral outrage, or a noble desire to protect the innocent. She was defending the family name, the carefully cultivated image of respectability that came with being Kellers in this small southern town where everyone knew everyone else's business and reputation meant everything. For the first time in 4 years, someone stood between me and Adrian's fists, and I didn't care what her motivations were as long as she kept doing it. Adrian attempted a new tactic, adopting the logical voice he used when attempting to persuade someone to see things his way, the same voice he'd used to convince me that his fury was my responsibility, that I brought it on myself through my own carelessness and foolishness. Mom, you don't understand the whole situation, he continued, spreading his hands in a phony, reasonable motion. She pushes me. She understands just what buttons to push to get me upset and how to provoke me. She does stuff on purpose to provoke a reaction from me. Sometimes I lose control for a brief moment, but she understands how to push me to that point. She isn't as innocent as she appears. Eleanor raised her hand as if she were stopping traffic, her wedding band reflecting the light from the chandelier. I've heard this before, she replied, her voice flat and impersonal. From your father, when he tried to explain why he punched through the kitchen wall. From every weak man who believes that his emotions are someone else's responsibility. From every coward who accuses his victim of lacking self-control and emotional maturity. She turned to face me, And for the first time since I'd known her, her gaze was almost maternal in a manner I'd never felt from my own mother, who died when I was 16. Pack a suitcase, she suggested gently. You'll be coming home with me tonight. We will sort out the rest later. I can't, I answered mechanically, the words rushing out faster than I could stop them, programmed by Adrienne's brainwashing. Adrienne needs me to make dinner for the Langfords. They're arriving at 7, and I still need to finish the preparations. The roast is still in the oven, and I have yet to prepare the dessert. I need to stay and finish everything. Adrienne needs to understand that his acts have consequences. She cut me off, her voice impervious to debate. And you must remember that you are a human being with worth and respect, not a servant, a punching bag, or a piece of property created simply for his convenience. The Langfords can order pizza if they're worried about dinner. Adrienne took a step forward, his face returning to the usual deadly crimson that always accompanied his most violent outbursts. She's not going anywhere, he snarled, his voice lowering into the low growl that had horrified me for 4 years. She's my wife. We made promises to God and everyone we knew, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. She can't just quit because we had one minor fight or disagreement. Eleanor Whitmore smiled for the first time since I'd known her, and it wasn't a happy one. It was the smile of a predator that had just caught its prey and was enjoying the moment before the kill. Actually, she continued, removing a big manila document from her pocketbook like a magician would with a rabbit from a hat, she's about to be your ex-wife. The folder was large, crammed with images and documents I'd never seen before, tied together with elastic bands and paper clips, and Eleanor spread them on the mahogany table like she was dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game with lives on the line. 4 years of documentation, she remarked quietly, her voice steady, as if she were talking about the weather or her garden club meeting. Every bruise, every excuse, every time you came to family gatherings, and she had mysterious injuries that she blamed on her own clumsiness or accidents. The photographs were devastating, more detailed than I could have imagined. Pictures of me at Christmas dinner with finger-shaped bruises on my upper arms, barely visible under the sleeves of my red dress, but caught by the camera's flash. Easter brunch with a split lip I blamed on tripping over our cat while carrying groceries, and my birthday party with a black eye hidden under heavy concealer and strategic lighting, but still visible if you knew what to look for. How did you get these? I mumbled, staring at photographs I couldn't even remember taking. Documented evidence of my own anguish that I'd worked so hard to conceal. I engaged a private investigator 3 years ago, she remarked matter-of-factly, as if she were talking about hiring a landscaper or a housekeeper. A very discreet man who specializes in domestic issues. I thought something was wrong, but I needed specific evidence before I could act. I couldn't make such serious claims based solely on assumptions and gut reactions. There were medical records from the urgent care clinic where I'd gotten stitches after Adrian pushed me into the coffee table during an argument about his gambling, as well as bank records showing how my paychecks were being deposited into an account controlled solely by Adrian, leaving me with no access to money. There were phone records of my calls to my sister, which were always cut short when Adrian came home early from work. There were photographs taken with telephoto lenses through our windows of Adrian grabbing me, shouting at me, and backing me into corners with his fist raised. And there were audio recordings of our fights, which I had no idea existed. The investigator had interviewed our neighbors, who admitted to hearing screaming and crashing sounds through our thin walls, but had never called the police because they didn't want to get involved in our private business. He'd also spoken with my coworkers, who confirmed that I frequently came to work with mysterious injuries and appeared afraid of my husband's reaction to minor mistakes. Adrian raced for the images, desperation making him awkward and uncoordinated, but Eleanor was faster, despite her age and the constraining nature of her fine clothes. She scooped them back into the folder, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "You're pathetic," she snarled to her son, and I'd never heard such pure scorn in a human voice. A weak, pathetic excuse for a man who hurts women to feel powerful because he's too much of a coward to face his true problems. You're worse than your father was because he had the excuse of growing up impoverished and desperate during the Depression. You had every advantage in life, education, money, and opportunities, and you decided to use them to destroy instead of build. Adrienne's mask of civilized behavior, which he'd worn in front of his mother his entire life, finally cracked and fell away like old paint. He came at her with the same rage I'd seen directed at me so many times before, his hand raised to strike the woman who had given birth to him, raised him, and loved him despite his fundamental flaws. But Eleanor Whitmore hadn't survived 42 years of marriage to a difficult man and raising 3 children without learning how to protect herself. She stepped aside with astonishing elegance for a woman in her mid-60s and pushed her knee up hard between his thighs. Adrienne fell like a stone, gasping and grasping himself on the polished hardwood floor. His face was purple, and he was making sounds like a wounded animal, curled in a fetal position on the beautiful rug his grandmother had brought back from Persia. Eleanor fixed her jacket with dignity, smoothed her skirt, and picked up her phone again. "Now I'm definitely calling the police," she stated casually, walking over her writhing son as if he were debris in her way. The next few hours flew by in a blur of uniforms and flashing lights that seemed surreal in the quiet neighborhood, where nothing exciting ever happened. Police sirens wailed through streets lined with perfectly manicured lawns and houses that looked like magazine covers. Statements were given in separate rooms, while social workers took notes and detectives asked questions I'd never expected to answer. Detective Lucia Ferraro was a compassionate woman with tired eyes who had definitely dealt with situations similar to mine previously. She asked extensive questions in a soft tone. "How often did he hit you? Did he ever threaten to kill you? Have you ever feared for your life? Did he control your access to money or communication with friends and family? Did he monitor your phone calls or emails? Did he isolate you from your support system?" The replies revealed a pattern of systematic abuse that had gone undetected by everyone except the private investigator Eleanor had hired. Yes, he had control over all of our money. Yes, he had persuaded me to cut relations with friends who didn't like him. Yes, he checked my phone and email on a daily basis. And yes, I was frightened he might murder me during his most violent outbursts. Eleanor held my hand through it all, never showing emotion except a slight tightening of her eyes when the detective described what the medical examiner would document during my domestic violence examination. Her fingers were cool and steady, anchoring me to reality when everything else felt like a nightmare. Adrienne was arrested for domestic violence and led away in handcuffs, while neighbors gathered on their perfectly manicured lawns to witness the spectacle. The great Adrian Keller, golden boy of the country club set and rising star in his father's law firm, reduced to shouting threats from the back of a police car while his mother watched with cold satisfaction. Later, as we sat in Eleanor's immaculate living room with its cream-colored furnishings and meticulously arranged fresh flowers, I finally voiced the subject that had been bothering me since she stood up to her own son. "Why now? If you knew what was happening, if you'd been documenting it for 3 years, why didn't you help me before?" Eleanor remained quiet for a long time, peering out the window at her immaculately manicured garden with every flower in its proper place. Then she reached into an ancient jewelry box on the side table and drew out an old photograph, its edges softened by age and handling. The photograph depicted a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, smiling at the camera with the radiant joy that only comes with true happiness and hope for the future. She was dressed in a wedding gown that must have been stunning 42 years ago, all lace and seed pearls and dreams of a perfect life with the man she loved. "This is my sister, Isabel Whitmore," Eleanor said quietly, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, vulnerable in a way that made her seem almost human. "She died when she was 28. Her husband beat her to death with a tire iron in their garage while their 2 children slept upstairs in their beds, completely unaware that their mother was dying just below them." I stared at the photo, my heart racing and my mouth dry. I had no idea Adrienne had an aunt, and I had never heard any stories about Eleanor's family other than the sanitized versions of rich businessmen and humanitarian work that she offered at dinner parties. "I was supposed to be her maid of honor," Eleanor continued, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph with the gentleness of someone handling something infinitely precious. "Instead, I was a pallbearer at her funeral 6 years later. I swore that day, standing beside her grave in the rain, that I would never let another woman in my family suffer what she suffered. I would never again fail to act when I saw the signs." "But you never liked me," I replied, still perplexed by the revelation. "You always made it clear I wasn't good enough for Adrian. You criticized everything I did. made me feel like I could never measure up to your standards." Eleanor sighed, and for the first time, she appeared all 66 years old. "I was trying to protect you in the only way I knew how," she told me. "I thought if I could convince you to leave on your own, if I could make you see that this family wasn't right for you, you'd be safer. When that didn't work, when I saw that you were just like Isabel, too loyal, too hopeful, too willing to believe that love could fix everything, I knew I had to take a different approach." She opened a second folder, this one even thicker than the first, and filled with legal paperwork and letters. I needed enough proof to ensure Adrienne would go to prison, not just get a slap on the wrist and court-ordered anger management classes that wouldn't change anything. I needed documentation that would hold up in court, that would convince a judge to keep him away from you permanently. The evidence was astounding in its comprehensiveness and attention to detail. 4 years of meticulous documentation from many sources, resulting in an airtight case that no defense attorney could overcome. Hospital records dating back to our honeymoon, when I claimed to have fallen downstairs, but the injury pattern suggested I'd been pushed. Police reports from wellness checks filed by neighbors who were more concerned than they admitted, and testimony from shopkeepers and service workers who had witnessed Adrienne's controlling and abusive behavior in public. "I had to be absolutely certain," Eleanor kept saying, her voice weighed down by her sister's legacy. "One chance to get him convicted and imprisoned, where he couldn't hurt you anymore. If I'd acted too early with insufficient evidence, he would have learned to be more careful. He would have isolated you completely, moved you away from anyone who might help, and the next time might have been the last time." Eleanor paid for the best family law attorney money could buy, a woman named Clara Voss, who specialized in domestic violence cases and had never lost a client to an abusive ex-husband. She was small, fierce, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting women from dangerous men. The divorce proceedings lasted 10 months and took place in courtrooms and lawyers' offices all over the county. Adrienne attempted to contest everything, hiring his own team of expensive lawyers to claim that I was an unfit wife who had driven him to violence through my own incompetence and manipulation. They portrayed me as a gold digger who had trapped him into marriage and then systematically destroyed his life through my failures as a homemaker and partner. Adrienne's case was completely shattered by the photographs, the medical records, Eleanor's private investigator's testimony, and the audio recordings, which revealed Adrienne's true nature in ways that no amount of expensive legal representation could ever overcome. During one particularly traumatic session, Clara played a recording of Adrienne threatening to kill me if I ever tried to leave him, his voice clear and unmistakable, promising to hunt me down and make me pay for embarrassing him. The judge's face turned white as she listened, and I saw her hands clench into fists. He received a 6-year state prison sentence for aggravated domestic abuse, with the option of parole after 4 years if he underwent substantial anger management and psychological counseling. The judge made it clear that any future infractions would result in much longer sentences. I received the house, hefty alimony to help me rebuild my life, and a restraining order that would follow him for the rest of his life. Eleanor and I never became close friends in the traditional sense, but we developed a complex relationship based on mutual respect and shared trauma. She helped me find a job at her charity foundation, working with other women who were trying to rebuild their lives after escaping abusive relationships. I helped her process the guilt she'd carried for 42 years over her sister's death and her failure to recognize the warning signs in time. On the day Adrienne was sentenced, Eleanor waited for me outside the courthouse steps. As we watched him being led away in handcuffs for what we hoped would be the last time, his face twisted with rage and shouting promises of vengeance that echoed off the courthouse walls, she turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "Isabel would have liked you," she continued quietly, her voice heavy with emotion she rarely allowed herself to exhibit. "You're stronger than either of us gave you credit for, stronger than she was, and certainly stronger than I was at your age when I had to make choices about my own marriage." 8 months later, I began volunteering at a women's shelter 3 towns away, far enough away to feel safe, but close enough to make a meaningful difference. I used my story to help other women recognize the signs of abuse that I had overlooked or rationalized for so long, to understand that they deserved better than fear and pain disguised as love. I discovered that Eleanor had been anonymously funding the shelter for years, ever since Isabel's death, pouring her guilt and grief into helping women escape the fate her sister had suffered. Listening to stories that mirrored my own, seeing the same fear, confusion, and desperate hope in other women's eyes, and assisting them in navigating the legal system and finding safe places to rebuild their lives was the most difficult work I'd ever done. It was emotionally exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated, but it was also healing, transformative in ways I could not have predicted. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter from Adrian in prison. The return address made my hands tremble so fiercely that I almost dropped it, but I pushed myself to open it despite every instinct telling me to throw it away unread. The letter was 6 pages of carefully crafted manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for blaming him for his imprisonment and hopeful that we could reconcile when he was released. It was exactly the kind of psychological warfare he'd always been good at, the same techniques that had kept me trapped for 4 years. He wrote about how sorry he was, how much he'd changed through prison counseling and reflection, how he now understood that what he'd done was wrong and would never happen again, and how he portrayed himself as a victim of his own emotions. A man who had loved me so much that he'd lost control but had learned better ways to express his feelings. The letter was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, hitting every button he knew would make me feel something. References to the good times we'd had, promises of the life we could have together if I just gave him another chance, subtle threats disguised as statements of love and devotion. I threw it away without reading more than the first paragraph, but I retained the envelope. My therapist had warned me that he would ultimately try to contact me and that I should document any efforts at communication for the police and the parole board. Some apologies come too late. Some bridges are supposed to be destroyed, and some individuals never truly change, no matter how persuasively they say differently in letters written from prison cells where they only have time to create their falsehoods. 3 years later, while volunteering at the shelter, I met Julian Morrow, a counselor who worked with male batterers and ran court-ordered programs to break the cycle of violence before it claimed more victims. He understood trauma and recovery in ways that most people couldn't, and he never made me feel damaged, broken, or responsible for what had happened to me. He was patient with my startled responses and night terrors, the way I trembled when anyone moved too swiftly near me, the way I still checked locks numerous times before bed. He understood why I needed space to heal while making it plain that he would wait as long as it took for me to regain confidence. He never raised his voice, never grabbed my arm to get my attention, and never made me feel like I was walking through a minefield of potential triggers. When I had panic attacks caused by unexpected sounds or movements, he would sit quietly nearby until I could breathe normally again, never making me feel broken or difficult. When he asked me to marry him after 3 years of painstaking wooing, Eleanor was the first person I phoned. "You're sure about this one?" she inquired, her voice heavy with the weight of our shared experience and the understanding of how disastrous things could turn out. "I'm sure," I responded, shocked by how certain I felt. "He makes me feel safe in a way I didn't know was possible. He sees my strength instead of trying to break it down." After a lengthy pause on the other end of the line, Eleanor continued, "Good. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve someone who cherishes you instead of diminishing you." At our tiny and personal wedding in the garden of the women's shelter, where we'd both helped, I wore Isabel's pearl necklace, which Alelenar had offered to me as something borrowed, something old. With quivering fingers, she tightened the tiny clasp around my neck and murmured, "She would have wanted you to have this. She would have wanted you to find happiness after surviving what you survived." The necklace was lovely, each pearl perfectly matched and lustrous, but more than that, it felt like a blessing from a woman I'd never met, but whose story had saved my life in ways she could never have predicted. Adrian got freed from prison that year. His sentence was reduced for good behavior and completion of anger management programs that clearly had not addressed his fundamental character flaws. Within the first month of his release, he violated his restraining order twice, once by showing up at the bookstore where I used to work, and once by following me to the grocery store where I shopped. He was calm and reasonable with the police, explaining that he was simply trying to rebuild his life and had no intention of bothering his ex-wife. But I knew better. He claimed that it was an accident, that he happened to be in the area and hadn't noticed me until it was too late to avoid contact. I recognized the calculated manner of his appearances, the way he positioned himself so that I could see him, the subtle smirk that suggested he could reach me whenever he wanted to, as psychological warfare designed to keep me terrified, to remind me that I would never be entirely free of him. Adrienne's act did not fool the judge, who sentenced him to another 3 years in prison with the understanding that any additional offenses would result in a considerably lengthier sentence. Some people, Eleanor observed directly, never learn from their mistakes because they don't believe they've made any. Julian and I have been married for 8 years, and we have 4 children, twin boys aged 6 and 2 girls, the oldest of whom recently turned 4. When one of my sons becomes irritated and his hands clench into fists, I keep a close eye on him with the vigilance that only a survivor can understand. I teach him to use his words, to walk away when he is furious, and to never use his strength to harm someone smaller than himself. The chats are age-appropriate yet honest. We discuss how it's okay to get angry at times, but hitting is never acceptable. We practice deep breathing and counting to 12, and we role-play healthier ways to deal with frustration and disappointment. My oldest daughter is tough and defiant, as Eleanor was at that age, with a steel spine and a reluctance to accept unfair treatment from anyone. When she was 4 years old, a guy at preschool shoved her off the swing set during an argument about whose turn it was. Instead of crying or running to a teacher, she marched over to him and told him in a clear, carrying voice that hitting was not acceptable, and that he needed to apologize and learn better behavior. The teacher later told me that it was the most articulate response to bullying she'd ever heard from a preschool student. I was both happy and afraid, glad that my daughter had such fortitude, but terrified that she could one day need it in ways I couldn't protect her from. Eleanor is Grandma Ellie to our children, and they adore her in the same way that children adore grandparents who spoil them and have endless patience for their questions and games. She takes them to museums and the zoo, teaches them about art and history, and tells them carefully edited stories about their brave mother who escaped from a dragon and found a prince who treated her with kindness. She has never informed them that the dragon was her own son, and I hope she never has to. Some family secrets are best kept hidden, especially when they involve those who are supposed to love and protect you. When my oldest kid asked why Julian wasn't my first husband, I told him a simple version of the truth that he could comprehend at his age. Sometimes adults make mistakes about who they marry, and sometimes people aren't as nice as they claim to be. But most importantly, people can start afresh and find true love with someone who respects them properly. Last month, my daughter asked me about the faint scars on my arms, marks that have faded over the years but never completely disappeared, like shadows of old injuries that serve as permanent reminders of what I survived. I told her that sometimes people we love hurt us, but that doesn't mean we have to let them hurt us again. That sometimes the bravest thing we can do is walk away from someone who claims to love us yet mistreats us. She nodded seriously, her tiny mind digesting knowledge that no kid should ever have to grasp. And then she asked if that's why I work at a place where sad ladies come to feel better, and why I occasionally receive phone calls late at night from women who sound afraid and crying. Yes, I replied softly. That is exactly why. If any of my children ever find themselves in a situation like mine, I hope they remember the lessons I'm trying to teach them now. That they have choices, that they don't have to accept abuse as love, fear as protection, or control as care. I hope they never fully understand what those scars mean, and that they never need to know the details of what their mother went through before they were born. Eleanor Whitmore taught me that family is more than simply blood, DNA, and shared last names. It's about who shows up when you need them the most, who stands between you and danger when the stakes are highest, even if they do it imperfectly, even when their goals aren't fully pure, or when they take longer than necessary to deal with their own problems and shame. She also taught me that sometimes the one who rescues you is the last person you expect, the one who appeared to be your enemy, but turned out to be your greatest ally. Sometimes deliverance comes from the most unlikely source, the mother-in-law who appeared to despise you, the woman who spent 4 years making you feel inadequate and unwelcome while actually constructing a case to defend you. Eleanor called a month earlier with news that didn't surprise either of us, but yet made my stomach clench with dread. Adrienne had been arrested again, this time for assaulting his new girlfriend in a bar parking lot after she attempted to break up with him. The girlfriend was 24, barely older than I had been when I married him, and she had the same terrified look in her eyes that I remembered seeing in mirrors during the worst times. He'll never change, Eleanor remarked, her voice exhausted but unsurprised by this latest development. But at least this time, someone will believe her from the beginning. At least this time, there will be consequences before it goes too far, before he has years to perfect his techniques of control and intimidation. I volunteered to testify at his trial about the pattern of abuse, about what it's like to live in constant fear of someone who claims to love you. According to the prosecutor, my testimony, combined with Eleanor's documentation and the new victim's injuries, should be enough to sentence him to a much longer prison term under the state's repeat offender statutes. Some dragons never stop breathing fire, never learn to control their destructive impulses. But sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we find someone willing to stand between us and the flames. Sometimes that someone is exactly who we'd expect: a friend, a family member, someone who loves us unconditionally. The truth about survival isn't that it makes you stronger, though that's what people like to say because it makes them feel better about the terrible things that happen in the world, but rather that it makes you more aware of your own strength that was always there, waiting for the right moment and the right person to help you recognize and use it. Eleanor Whitmore saw that strength in me before I knew it existed, before I believed I deserved better than what I was getting. And because she did, she spent years meticulously collecting the evidence that would free me. And I not only survived, but thrived because she stood up to her own son in defense of a daughter-in-law she'd spent 4 years attempting to drive away. I was able to live, discover true love, have children, and assist other women in escaping their own dragons. Sometimes love doesn't look like we expect it to. It doesn't come with warm hugs and gentle words and obvious affection. It doesn't look like a perfectly dressed mother-in-law calmly gathering evidence while her son destroys his wife piece by piece. It doesn't look like 4 years of patient documentation waiting for the perfect moment to strike with devastating effectiveness, or it looks like a knee to the groin and a phone call. Sometimes the most stunning thing isn't the violence itself, but who will step up to stop it. Who will put their own comfort and family relationships at risk to protect someone they hardly know but perceive as deserving of protection? Eleanor Whitmore taught me that heroism does not always appear heroic, and that sometimes the people who save us understand exactly how much we need saving because they have been there themselves, because they have carried the weight of someone else's death and refused to allow it to happen again. Today, I'm 34 years old, happily married to a man who has never made me fearful, and raising 4 children who will understand that they deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. I manage a nonprofit organization that assists domestic abuse survivors in finding housing and legal support, which is partially funded by Eleanor's ongoing donations and partially by grants that I've learned to write and fundraise for. Sometimes I look back on my life and can't believe how far I've come, from that terrified lady crouching in a spotless dining room, waiting for the next blow to fall. The metamorphosis feels unbelievable, as if it occurred to someone else in a tale I read. But then I touch the faint scars on my arms, or see Isabel's pearls in my jewelry box, or watch Eleanor teach my daughter to stand up straight and speak with confidence. And I remember that it's all real. The pain was real, but so was the rescue. The fear was real, but so was the strength I found to walk away when someone finally showed me I had the option. Not everyone has an Eleanor Whitmore in their lives, or someone prepared to spend years establishing a solid legal case against their own child, but everyone deserves one. And that's why I do what I do now. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to believe you, one person willing to stand up and say enough, one person who sees your worth even when you've forgotten it. Sometimes that person comes from the most unlikely location, just when you've given up hope that anybody will ever help you. Sometimes salvation looks like a slap, heard around the world, witnessed by the right person who refuses to let it go unanswered.